Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Are you a licensed mental health professional looking to deepen your clinical expertise in healing complex trauma? We are thrilled to announce our Summer 2025 NARM Therapist Training offering, designed to equip you with the transformative power of the NeuroAffective Relational Model. The summer online cohort for the NARM Therapist Training runs from May to December 2025. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma, and C-PTSD. You'll gain specialized trauma-informed training that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. Join us and experience the integration of the neurobiologically informed clinical approach that promotes post-traumatic growth. Become part of a community where mindfulness meets clinical expertise and embody professional and personal growth with a catalyst for transformation in your practice and community. Visit ComplexTraumaTrainingCenter.com to register for the Summer 2025 NARM Therapist Training. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. And now for our interview. Dr. Laurence Heller is the creator of the NeuroAffective Relational Model, international trainer, and co-author of Healing Developmental Trauma: How Early Trauma Affects Self-Regulation, Self-Image, and the Capacity for Relationship. He also co-authored Crash Course, a self-healing guide to auto-accident trauma and recovery. Dr. Heller co-authored the Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, using the NeuroAffective Relational Model to address adverse childhood experiences and resolve complex trauma, which presents one of the first comprehensive therapeutic models for addressing complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It introduces an integrated mind-body approach for treating attachment, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. Dr. Heller's forthcoming book with Stephan Konrad Niederwieser is about chronic shame and guilt. Dr. Heller is the founder and director of the NARM Training Institute and teaches regularly in the U.S. and Europe. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Laurence Heller. All right, I am sitting here with Dr. Laurence Heller. Larry, it's so great to have you back on Transforming Trauma.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And when we were talking about kind of some of the options that we had to explore today, you had some ideas. And so I'd love for listeners to hear what you'd like for all of us to get from our time together today.
Well, my current project is we're in the last kind of month or month and a half of editing a new book on shame. And I know that that's an interesting topic to a lot of people. And so I thought that would be an interesting topic for us, at least to begin with. And take it from there.
Beautiful. I love it. And so in that exploration of shame, you're writing this book. I'm curious, it sounds like probably some new things have come up for you. For anyone who isn't maybe as familiar with the work that you've done, maybe there are new listeners, can you share just a little bit about your background and how you came to this work?
Well, I've been in the field for a long time, and I experienced, as part of my formal training and then as part of just personal interest, I experienced in the earlier days, many years ago now, a variety of different models: psychodynamic, Gestalt, bioenergetics, Reichian work, a million different kinds of body work, spiritual work, all these kinds of things. And part of what I saw at the time was that a lot of people were being missed. There were a lot of elements in the models that I felt were actually counterproductive. And so I set out to create NARM, drawing on both some of the useful things that I drew from these different models, but making some changes that I thought were really important in terms of that we don't interpret, we don't analyze, for example, we don't pathologize in the way that, I think some traditional psychotherapies tend to do. And there's a very different focus on history, how history impacts us. So it was important for me to build all that into the NARM model as I was developing, and many other things that I won't go into a full history of the development of NARM, but just to give listeners and, the sense of where I'm coming from. And, in recent years, I've just been seeing the importance of the theme of shame particularly in relationship to one of the reactions, and actually what might surprise people, both a strategy and a symptom that shame is, to look at this whole dynamic of shame from a very different perspective. Now, and there surprisingly isn't a lot of information out there about shame, strangely enough, or at least information that I found helpful. Like Brene Brown's work on shame was a really good start, very useful. She talks about vulnerability that's underneath shame, and I agree with all that. But there's so much more to the role that shame plays in our lives that really just hasn't been previously documented or documented well, from my point of view. And so I thought that it would be an important contribution to let people get a broader sense of just how significant shame is in human life.
Yeah. And I appreciate you naming this piece around it's both a symptom and a strategy. And I know I've had conversations with folks where people are like, there's no utility, there's no usefulness or function of shame. It's just bad. It's just, and I know that you hold it a bit differently. So I'm curious, where would you like to start?
Well, let's start with what your last point, which was seeing it as a strategy, because not everybody will even understand. I mean, I know a lot of your listeners will understand how we use strategy in NARM, but it's basically a coping mechanism. It's a little more complex than that, but that's just so that any new listeners have an idea of what I mean when I say strategy. So it's a self-protective kind of strategy. And again, in NARM, I don't use the word defense because I don't like that word. It's pathologizing. It's part of the shift that I tried to create in developing the model of NARM. But ultimately, it's a way of protecting the attachment relationship usually with the primary caregivers, or in most cases, the parents. And I put shame on a spectrum: shame, self-hatred, self-rejection, self-judgment, and on a behavioral level, self-sabotage. So these are all of these themes are connected. So I look at them. I talk about shame because it's a shorthand, but really it includes all of these elements. And, one of the things that it goes back to a very basic understanding in NARM, which is that there's this developmental process that for many, particularly when there's significant neglect or abuse or significant misattunement, one of the natural reactions on a child's part is to be angry. If their basic, needs are not being met, for example, they will protest at the beginning. And if that protest isn't addressed or isn't responded to, then it'll become anger. And that's dangerous for a child, because from a child's perspective, they can't hold both anger and love for the parent. So it's threatening from an internal perspective for the child. It's frightening to the child that the anger would overwhelm the love that they feel, and then there would be no love in the universe. So that's an internal danger. And I think you and I will talk more about how that works. Yeah. But then there's also an external danger for the child getting angry at the parents, which is that some parents retaliate. And of course, the power dynamics are very clear that the child can't fight back. And sometimes, when a child protests, the parents who already have a tendency to be, let's say, physically abusive, for example, will then be abusive to the child. So there's these dual threats, both from the outside and from the inside, that need to be addressed in terms of resolution of shame and self-hatred, self-judgment. And, many models, mindfulness and other models that build in mindfulness, talk about compassion. And that's extremely important. It's useful. And we, of course, that's part of the NARM work, is that to help people learn how to be kinder, more compassionate to themselves. But what a lot of clinicians don't understand is that there is a threat to becoming too compassionate to yourself. Because if it's not your fault from the child's perspective, there's no hope. So that's why it's confused clinicians. Yeah. Why won't people accept that they're not as bad as they think that they are? And the deeper understanding is because it threatens, on an unconscious level, it threatens the attachment, relationship. And, I've said this in other contexts, but it's better to be the unlovable child of parents who have capacity for love than the lovable child of parents who don't have the capacity to love. Because if the child experiences the parents as not having the capacity to love, that's like the end of their universe for them. So there's that element of, as painful as shaming, self-hatred, self-rejection, and so on is, it feels better than the alternative. And that's where we have to work with people to help them see, just how, well, to help them deepen their compassion and to help them see just how toxic really their shame has been in their lives, how many ways it's affected them. That's a very brief kind of intro to that.
I so appreciate you I feel like you just connected some dots, because these are all, I imagine a lot of listeners are thinking, yeah, all those things make sense. But when you put them all together and pull them close, it lands a little bit deeper, I think, for those of us even that are familiar with some of these concepts. But this idea that it's more terrifying for a child to think, actually, I'm not the problem. I'm being raised by people that don't have capacity. That's obviously a sophisticated way of thinking about it. But that perspective is even more terrifying and threatening than to keep blaming ourselves and thinking this is something I maybe have control over if I can just be different or better or, not so broken in some way.
There's one other issue too, which is it isn't consistent with how a child's mind works either. For example, we know that when parents are divorcing, how many times, if they're aware of it at all, but if they're aware parents, they know how much they have to convince the child that it's not their fault. Because the child's mind, and it changes over different stages of development, but the child's mind tends to view things in that way. And if parents are divorcing, for example, they think it's their fault. And convincing them takes some time often. So that's also part of the bigger picture here.
Yeah. So considering the place in their development is really important. Thank you for naming that.
And then, that's what we call child consciousness, so that an adult consciousness perspective, we can feel compassionate for ourselves. We can deal with whatever shame dynamics we're experiencing more directly. We can start developing an increasing distance from this self-shaming dynamic, which is another piece that's really important in my perspective on shame, which is that we see it as a verb and not a noun, and like a reflexive verb, meaning we do it to ourselves as adults. Now, as children, we just take it on sometimes explicitly. You're an idiot. What? I wish you had never been born. I mean, I've heard so many terrible things that parents have said to their children over the years. So, you're not as pretty as your sister. All these kinds of things that we've all heard a million times. So we take on the shaming from the outside directly, but then it also becomes, again, a solution. It's a seeming solution. People can't see that I'm necessarily doing my hand quotes here, but it seems like a solution to take on the shame as their own. And as we know in NARM, an important element that everyone experiences is that they take on the environmental failure that they experienced as children, whatever degree and whatever form that took, and they carry that forward with them in adulthood. And shame is one of the more important dynamics of elements that we first take on from the outside, or at least come up with as a solution to the difficulties we're having in our family. And we then carry forward and shame ourselves into adulthood. And it's so helpful clinically for people to see that they're blaming themselves or shaming themselves or that they're criticizing themselves, that it's not just something that happens. You're not just attacked by shame. It's playing a role in the ecology, the overall ecology of your personality, and it makes sense. So that's kind of an overview of some of why I see this as such an important thing in people's lives.
Yeah. Okay. So in what you just said, what kind of landed in that moment for me was, quote, shame is a, quote, solution or a strategy. Is that kind of, you're equating the two things? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
well, let's say an attempted solution.
An attempted solution. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It functions in a kind of way in childhood that is useful. And when we bring it with us into adulthood, this attempted solution, most of us figure out is no longer going to work in the same way.
Right.
Okay. So where would you like to take us next? That's kind of a broad overview, maybe of your concept of shame. And there might be people that are still having some questions like, no, shame is always bad, but let's go in a little bit deeper with us.
Shame is always unpleasant. I would agree with that.
Okay.
And it is also true that sometimes as an individual going through their therapeutic process, they see how much they shame themselves, then they'll shame themselves for shaming themselves. So it can be a kind of a repetitive process.
Yeah.
But I think the first point that I'd like to emphasize here is the hidden dimension of shame that I see I got your attention.
Yeah, say more.
But there is a significant hidden dimension to shame, which is that human beings will do their best if they feel shame in a certain area to avoid that area. So one of the hidden dimensions is how we narrow our lives. All of the things that we don't do or say or take a risk with or experiment with because we're afraid that we'll fail and then we'll shame ourselves for quote unquote failing. And so this narrowing of one's life in order to avoid the possibility of shame has huge implications. And I want to give just a few examples because they may not be exactly what people think. So when I'm teaching, I like to bring participants' attention to all of the people that they feel love for that they don't share it with because it feels too vulnerable. And when they're vulnerable, and if the person doesn't accept it in the way that they would hope for, then they would shame themselves for it. Oh, I did it at the wrong time, or I shouldn't have opened my big mouth, all the kinds of self-talk that people do. So just even in terms of communicating our love. Now, there are developmentally also other kinds of issues so that we, for example, out of shame, we don't communicate our needs. Or out of shame, we don't set limits with people. Or out of shame, we don't open our hearts. So all of these areas of life where we limit ourselves in order to protect ourselves from the possibility of feeling shame. And I like to say, and it's at the beginning of this new book that's going to be coming out next fall on shame, is that I started this with most of what you experience as shame, I'm talking to the reader, most of what you experience as shame has nothing to do with you. And that's a new thought for many people because we tend to take shame so seriously because it's extremely painful. So my point being is that this is something we've learned and we weren't born with it. That's something we can then unlearn. And since it's something we're doing to ourselves, there's more agency in that we can particularly, as it gets clearer and clearer to us, we can stop doing it to ourselves. You really can, not like turn it off like a switch and then it's all gone. But over time, as you get less identified with the shame, you develop a certain kind of emotional distance from that dynamic. And then, some people have shared with me, I was starting to really be hard on myself. And then I thought about our work together and I thought, I don't need to go there, And so they start seeing that where they didn't have a choice previously, they do have choices now. That's really brings a kind of freedom that, people cherish.
I appreciate you're articulating it in a kind of way that is making sense in my brain. And I don't know that I've had quite the words to separate out this piece around shaming ourselves. I've had clients, when I'll reflect back, oh, it sounds like you're shaming yourself or whatever. They're like, no, I'm not shaming myself. This is like a shame attack, or you know what I mean? Like that kind of way of relating to it. And so what you're clarifying, at least for me, in terms of how to talk about it, is there's a way to notice, and I don't know if you would say this, in this practice, as you continue forward in this work, there comes a point, and I'll just speak from my own experience, it felt like there was a point where I just started noticing that choice, like you're saying, oh, I don't need to go there, actually. Whereas before it didn't feel like a choice. It just felt like it was just happening to me. So I just appreciate the way you're talking about that, because some might be listening where they're still in that place where it doesn't feel like a choice at all.
Right. Yeah. I have heard people say exactly what you said. I'm having a shame attack, or my brain is shaming me. Various kinds of ways of people trying to make sense of it. And we have to understand that, it is challenging. So, and we don't assume that we say it once and that the client's going to get it. It takes some time to see these patterns, often multiple times before we start getting some increasing distance and clarity about the whole process.
What is that process? You're saying it takes some time, or it takes, what exactly is that? Is it a practice? What is happening that helps kind of reveal this choice that you have?
Well, clinically, I talk about it as disidentification. It's part of a disidentification process to see that we're, on one level, we're not nearly as bad as we tend to think of ourselves. In NARM, as many of your listeners know, there are 5 different survival styles. Each one of these survival styles is shame-based. So, the connection survival is shame at existing. The attunement survival style, shame at needing. The trust survival style, shame at being dependent. The autonomy survival style, shame at being independent. And the love of sexuality, the shame for being a sexual person, the shame about opening their heart and being too vulnerable. So much of what we take to be our identity is actually these shame-based identifications that we've come to take as our own and believe that they're real and they're painful. And when we're in them, they are real. I'm not trying to minimize that. But ultimately, we can see through the fiction of that whole dynamic. And usually that requires looking at different themes from different directions before we start to get a sense of the bigger dynamic of shame in any of our lives. And, there are some differences with people, of course, but there are these overall patterns that anybody who struggles with any kind of emotional issues or relational issues, there's often a significant level of shame that's involved in one way or another. And it takes time to see all that.
Yeah. So as our clients or the folks that we're working with are starting to have that awareness and they're seeing these choices, noticing the ways that they're shaming themselves, what's kind of the next exploration?
Well, let me actually back it up just a little bit, kind of fill in an important step is that the relational process, which is the R in NARM, as many people know, the relational process is extremely important because when people come in to therapy with us, they're anticipating, no matter how nice we present and how nice we are as people, they're expecting us to be like their parents in one way or another. That's transference. That's the classic understanding of transference. But, they're particularly expecting us to judge them and shame them in the ways that they were judged and shamed and blamed. And many clients will already be avoiding things because it feels too shameful, or there are whole dynamics that are going on there. But one of the things that develops over time is as the therapist, when they're truly coming from a non-judgmental place, which is what we try to support in the development of NARM therapists, is that we really aren't there to judge. And, most experienced therapists have heard all kinds of stories and difficult, so we're not there, ideal at least, we're not there in the judging business. And this becomes part of the relational dynamic between the therapist and the client. And when, over time, we point out how hard they are in being on themselves, or how they're shaming themselves, or how they're beating themselves up, or whatever the dynamic is, they come to see that we're not judging them. And when that old transference bubble starts to dissolve and they're not projecting the shaming dynamic onto us, and actually they're beginning to take in the compassion, the acceptance, the non-judgmentalness that we have, that starts to change something for them. And the traditional language is that we become the introjected empathic object. And for some people's lives, we are literally the first person who hasn't judged them that they've known, or the first person who accepts all of their complexity, including the difficult parts of their personality, who, isn't there at all in any kind of judging way. And that also starts to get internalized by the client. And I've heard this exact thing, and I touched on it just a minute ago. It's like, I made a mistake at work and I was really starting to beat up on myself. And then I thought about you. And they'll often put it just that way. I don't get that judgment from you, and I don't need to do that to myself, or, variations on that theme. But this seeing you as that introjected empathic object is an important first start. And over time, that deepens, and their capacity to internalize that deepens. And as their understanding of the shame and self-shaming dynamics and self-judging and self-blaming dynamics that they've been carrying around, they are able to slowly separate from that.
I'm feeling touched right now, Larry. I'm kind of just connecting to my own experience of that.
Oh, well, yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it's such a real experience. So yeah, kind of putting myself in the client chair, having very similar thoughts of noticing I tend to, beat myself up in this way. And then knowing this person and how they always held me with this very open, non-judgmental, way of being with me, how impactful that has been for me. So anyway, I haven't thought specifically about that in a while, and even that relationship, which is interesting because I just reconnected with that person yesterday and I hadn't spoken with them in a long time. And so it feels maybe kind of fresh. But yeah, I'm just appreciating the way that you're talking, and I'm sure our listeners will connect with that as well.
Can I use this brief interaction as a
Please.
teaching moment here?
Mm-hmm.
One, I'm feeling touched by your willingness to be vulnerable here and to talk about your own process. And in terms of the theme that we're dealing with, it reflects to me that how much whatever work you've done on shame, how successful you've been. Because for many people to be emotional, with thousands of people listening, they would shame themselves for that. And the fact that it was so easy for you not to tells me that you've made significant progress with whatever shaming dynamics or self-shaming dynamics that you dealt with.
Yeah.
It's touching
Thank you.
to see, really.
Thank you. I do feel that. And yeah, that feels really true. I've worked really hard to be able to kind of just show up, not just in vulnerable ways, but know that I'm being seen by people. And there will be some people who judge, and that's not about me, to hold it in a different kind of way.
Exactly. And that last point is a very important point, too, that people will get to when they've done their work on shame is that, yeah, well, maybe if you say no to somebody, they won't like you. Or did they really like you if you only said yes to them in the first place?
Yeah.
It is true, though, but our capacity to not take personally what is really somebody else's stuff is a nice side effect of working through our own shame. And that we don't automatically take it on, and we're able to see, what's theirs. And we're also, when we're not shaming ourselves, we're also able to see what's ours because there's no shame. Oh, yeah, I really did screw up here. I really wasn't very sensitive in this context or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like, it doesn't make me a terrible person. I don't have to beat myself up for it, but I can, it creates a permeability in ourselves and in relationships that takes our experience of these dynamics to a whole deeper level of connection.
That's interesting. You said this thing about permeability. It's kind of like there's things that we can't see maybe when we're shaming ourselves. It's hard sometimes at the beginning of this whole process to see the way that we're shaming ourselves. And there's something about that piece you just said around this increased capacity to also be able to see the ways where maybe we did make mistakes. That feels really important to me because I see, again, looking at my own history, ways that I both couldn't take in love and also couldn't take in feedback or correction. I was kind of armored against both. It feels related to me. I don't know if that feels relevant to you in this moment, but.
No, I think they absolutely are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was hard to take in both love and acceptance. And also if there was something I genuinely messed up on or whatever, that blind spot, I couldn't take in any feedback either. And so it's interesting. Yeah, looking back at my own process and what that continues to mean for me. Not that I'm done. I'm not cooked yet, but.
Well, again, I appreciate you sharing that because I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate to just exactly that experience. And for other people who are not there yet, to give them some hope that we don't have to walk around continually being so hard on ourselves, judging ourselves, all the things that we do. And that despite whatever shame-based identification that we have that we're not lovable, we can actually take in loving feedback from others and we can allow the energetic and emotional expansion that takes place as we allow more love from the outside and to experience our own love from the inside. It creates a whole different kind of spaciousness that is what awaits on this other side of the shame-based identifications that we all carry in different forms and in different degrees.
Yeah. Okay. The way you just said that, distilled it down for me, what I was trying to say, and I kind of said it, but this piece around, I both was so hard on myself and beating myself up for stuff that maybe I hadn't even done, but also when I did, fail in some way that I couldn't see it. I wouldn't let myself see it because it was so painful. I knew I'd beat myself up. So anyway, that's what you're helping me kind of crystallize for myself in terms of my own articulation.
Yeah. What I associate, just maybe a specific example that a lot of people maybe can relate to, is at least traditionally, I don't know, I haven't seen any current lists, but public speaking has been always at the top of many people's lists of their biggest fear.
Yes.
Well, what are they really afraid of? They're afraid that they're going to make a mistake, do something in their mind that's dumb, self-judgment, and that people will reject them, judge them, all kinds of things. Now, the weird paradox here is that when we shame ourselves, that creates, just on a nervous system level, when we're shaming ourselves, that is a threat that activates the fight-flight response, so sympathetic activation. When there's sympathetic activation, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. So when a person is going up to present and they're already anticipating the shame, they do start to go blank because their prefrontal cortex is going offline. Because if they make a mistake, they project often the people listening that they'll judge them, but they're actually judging themselves or will judge themselves if they make a mistake. And as soon as we make having the kind of outcome that we desire the crux of whether we shame ourselves or not, we have put ourselves in an impossible situation because we're now trying to, let's say, give a public lecture with the sword of Damocles hanging over our head. If I screw up or if I make a mistake or if I forget my words or whatever, then I'm making a fool of myself. I'll be embarrassed, and we get all worked up in that. And as a result, we don't then perform to what our capacity might have been because we've got all this other stuff going on.
Yeah. Thank you for kind of painting that and just helping me, again, center into the core of that. Okay, so where would you like to take us next?
Let me maybe go back to the relationship of the child now to the environment, particularly to the parents, but sometimes it becomes a whole family environment. And where, of course, the parents' impact, both direct when it's verbal in words or indirect when it's just, certain kinds of behavior, have a huge impact on the child. And all of these dynamics that I was describing, they start affecting the child so that if they can't, then they often, if there's so much writing on learning, let's say a particular piece of homework, they'll get stuck there because they're afraid of the punishment that they'll experience either directly or what they'll do to themselves if they don't learn it, don't learn this particular lesson, whatever it is that they're studying. And this then can have a lifelong impact on a person's capacity to study effectively, or many people, they're anticipating failure and they consider themselves bad test takers. Well, whenever I've heard a client say that, I say, well, let's look at that dynamic that you say you're a bad test taker. What does that mean? And then we do what we do in NARM, which is explore it experientially. And what these so-called bad test takers always discover is some element of the pressure that they're putting on themselves. And that pressure is driven by the fear of shame or shame itself. And so they become self-fulfilling prophecies that can affect us our whole lives and then lead us down all kinds of paths of avoiding many elements of life because we don't want to appear dumb, or we don't want to appear, foolish, or we don't want to make mistakes, or we've got to do things right. We can't do anything wrong. All of this stuff that was presented to us as children, and then we torture ourselves with as we move into adulthood. So,
yeah. So I'm hearing in that this piece around the shaming ourselves and the fear, they go together.
Yeah. When we look at, as we do in NARM, we always, what is your worst fear about this? And the worst fear is always child consciousness. It's always what I talk about as futuristic memory. We're afraid that we're going to experience something that we've already experienced, but we didn't know how to process it. So it's like the fear has specific elements to it, and they're unique to each person to some degree at least. And so we deconstruct, okay, what is the fear? And then if we, let's say, discover shame or self-rejection or self-judgment underneath that, then we look at, okay, and what's that? What is that about?
Yeah.
And as human beings, we're really pretty basic. We all just want to love and to be loved, and so much of this is just, we get the ideas, again, out of developmental difficulties that if we don't do things perfectly, or if we say no to people, or if we express our needs, that we're not going to be loved. It's as simple as that. I always used to talk about it just as love, the fear of the loss of love from the parents. And then I started building in, and because it's real and it's important, the fear of the loss of the attachment relationship.
Right.
But when we talk about the fear of loss of love, that touches us on a much more human level. Attachment is an idea, it's abstract. But when we think about it, we're trying hard to be loved. And when we've had a lot of shame in our lives, that comes into the mix and makes it much more difficult for us. But that basically, if we have to perform for love, then it's not really love.
Mm.
And so, really, what we all want, in my experience at least, we want to be met, we want to be accepted for who we are. But if we don't have that internal acceptance, we won't see it if it's there. We won't take it in if it's offered to us. And we don't know how to support that in ourselves as well. So it's all these complexities.
Mm. Yeah, that piece that you just said about if we have to perform for love, it's not love. I think there's probably a lot of folks that can resonate with that. And there's something, and I don't know how you've talked about this. I feel like I've heard you talk about this, the idea of unconditional positive regard. And I'm curious how you hold that, because I know you have some different thoughts about it. Can I put that on the table to talk about it for a minute?
Sure. I mean, I think that was actually Rogers who originally brought that up. But in the kind of acceptance and non-judgmentalness that we as NARM therapists hold, there is an element of this unconditional positive regard because we're not there to judge anything. As a matter of fact, just the opposite. We're there to help the client understand their own internal world, their own relational world from an increasingly less biased perspective, less biased by their personal history. So that, the more we work through shame, the more that we come fresh to each relational encounter or each relationship. And this development of unconditional regard is an important part of that to really, on the deepest level, accept that despite our fantasies about other people's lives, because we always imagine that it's easier and better for other people, but despite those fantasies, everybody's struggling in one way or another with these things. And certainly there are differences in the degree of struggle, but that we're all pretty simple. We're just humans doing the best we can with what we know at any given time. And in just that statement, we're all doing the best we can with what we know at any given time. There is a kind of acceptance and positive regard that is supporting that. So it does come into play.
Yeah. So I'm curious as we're kind of continuing to deepen into this topic of shame, because in NARM, agency is such a vital part of that. Can you talk about and maybe link a little bit this concept of shame with agency?
Well, as I started off talking about the theme of self-shaming, to see that as adults, that's something that we're doing to ourselves. But again, we have to be sensitive. Like I said before, some people will shame themselves for that, and then we need to address that. But this concept of agency, as we talk about it in NARM, has even broader applications, so that it's really been important for me that we avoid what I talk about, maybe unfairly, but sometimes talk about as the psychodynamic fallacy, that we're this way now because this happened to us. I'm certainly not painting all psychodynamic people because that was part of my background too. I'm not making a case against psychodynamic work, but I'm just saying that there is this tendency when people who are psychodynamically informed to think that what happened in the past is directly the cause of what we're experiencing in the present. And that's, from my point of view, that's reductionistic. It's never as simple as that. So people, for example, might say, oh, I have a really hard time with anger, my anger or anybody else's anger, because my dad was, a rageaholic. And many therapists will accept that at face value, that's the case. Oh, okay. But it's not. It's not that it's completely irrelevant, but it's just a very, very tiny piece of that picture. So agency has to do with the fact that we all have organizing selves, and we have all organized our experience in certain ways and around certain, following certain pathways. And the more that we can see, for example, that agency is actually the link between the past and the present, so that it's not just the past causing what's happening in the present. But using this example, let's say we grew up in a family where one or maybe even both parents were filled with rage and acted it out. And that, of course, that's very frightening for a child, but that's not the whole answer. At a certain point, we start to see in that context that anger, it can be toxic. when it's a behavior and not just an emotion, when it's acted out. And we make a decision that when I grow up, I will be just the opposite of my parents. And so they take that, experience, but then this is where the process of agency begins. They start creating these strategies that will then exclude anger, so that they see that it's much more than just I'm this way because my father was that way. Or there are other things too. There are other elements that need to be looked at before a person can really integrate and find the kind of emotional regulation, particularly, let's say, around the theme of anger that we're talking about. Another element might be that really they're afraid of their own angry impulses, because when we're surrounded, let's say, by physically or emotionally abusive caretakers or parents, for example, we also, as children, have a powerful anger and rage response. And we have all kinds of thoughts that are frightening to children, even wanting to hurt back. And again, I'm making very clear the distinction between behaviors and thoughts and feelings. Right. But then, so we start to develop this fear of our own anger. And that's often a place where I have to help the client make the distinction between anger, the emotion, and behaviors that come out of anger, but are not anger itself, so that they can begin to allow anger, the emotion, which is just an energetic state, and a powerful energetic state, particularly as it gets integrated. And they can see that they have impulse control. They've never acted out, Somebody has acted out, gotten in bar fights, let's say, or various kinds of things. Then I work with them differently. But the bigger percentage of clients have, maybe they've yelled at somebody, but they've never actually, gotten a fight, a physical fight. So that when there aren't impulse control issues, we can then address the anger itself and some of the violent fantasies that are there and what the meaning is. What is it they're trying to communicate to us? And it helps us understand, you read articles and things like, why is there so much violence in the media, in movies, for example? Well, there's so much violence in movies is because there's a lot of violence in people. Now, fortunately, for most people who have the impulse control, it isn't acted out, or hopefully not acted out in any serious ways. But we need to come to terms with those parts of ourselves. And I think that some of the elements of humanistic psychology downplayed the fact that we do. And I don't see them like in the old model, the psychoanalytic model, that they were necessarily instinctive, where anger is instinctive, but it's not like we're basically bad or anything like that. But that's the way we've met and adapted to the traumatic situations, the abusive situations, for example, or neglectful situations that we've experienced. And that we can begin to accept our own anger and not be so afraid of it. And in that process, and put words to it in a way that we then can integrate the powerful energies that are really just the life force in all of us that gets shut down when we've had to close off protest, stop our anger, disconnect in profound ways from rage. And then we're carrying all this stuff around. We know it on some level. And it frightens us. And so we continue a vicious cycle is that we shut down even more, avoid more possibilities in life. And then bitterness comes and anger with that. So it gets complex. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't want to make it sound too complex, but just this point of seeing that it's us that is carrying the anger. Even when I get afraid of somebody else's anger in the room, if they're not directly threatening me, it's because it's triggering something in myself that I'm afraid to look at. And that's agency. At the same time that it's agency, it's an increasing development of that organizing self. And it's really what makes the difference between behaviorist approaches, which don't emphasize the organizing self at nearly the degree, if at all sometimes, as we do in NARM, is that organizing self, which is intimately connected to agency, the more that develops, the more equipped we are to deal with our own internal world and the external world that we live in at the same time.
Yeah, there's some things kind of landing for me right now. Yeah, I'm sure that there's people hearing this that are, maybe it's piquing some curiosity. So you're weaving in this piece around agency and shame, and you're separating out the emotion from the behavior, which I think is really important.
That is extremely important because I see therapists who are confused by that too.
Yeah.
That like conflating the two because they're very, very different. We can have all kinds of angry thoughts and,
Mm-hmm.
and despite what you sometimes read, angry, even in some kinds of spiritual approaches, angry thoughts are just angry thoughts. We have,
Mm-hmm.
as human beings, we have all kinds of thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what we do with them, which is behavioral, that's where we have responsibility there. In other words, responsibility not to act it out. But part of the challenge then is that if those people who've emphasized not acting it out don't realize how much they acted in
Mm.
and how many
Mm-hmm.
of the symptoms that they experience, including anxiety and depression and burnout and all kinds of other things, are connected to turning the anger against ourselves in the forms that I've talked about, shaming, self-hatred, self-judgment, and those things, but as well as the behavioral process of avoiding so many areas because we might start feeling things that we're uncomfortable or don't know how to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you naming, like, as a new therapist, I know that I kind of made this mistake of conflating the two. Like, oh, this person's feeling some really intense anger and maybe sort of fantasizing about things. And I think I could have, luckily I had some good consultation, but I think I could have taken that in a direction that wasn't necessarily useful. So,
And it is important, just as a kind of a little teaching moment too, for many people listening, is that we do have to have some idea of the client's impulse control before we begin to address their anger. So if they have difficulties with impulse control, that's important for us to know because any words that we put to it won't be as meaningful if they have a history of acting it out. And we have to then address it in a different way until they get more organized enough that the impulse control is more present so that they can then look at their angry thoughts and impulses and emotions and not act them out and not act them in. And that is such a beautiful moment when anger starts to be integrated in a person, the aliveness that comes, the connection to body, the increased self-regulation, autonomic regulation, and increased emotional regulation, all of these things just by integrating anger. And strangely enough, as we come full circle here, the more that we listen to, feel, and understand our anger, the less need we have to shame ourselves. So there's this vicious cycle and a virtuous cycle that we find ourselves in sometimes in our clients, but there's also a virtuous cycle too. The more we deal with our shame, the more available our anger is to us, the more we're able to integrate anger, the less there is any need to shame ourselves. And that's the virtuous cycle.
Yeah. Beautiful. I have a question. I just heard this phrase the other day and I thought it was so interesting and it feels a little relevant, at least to me in this moment. Something to the effect of anger is an initiation, not a transformation. Does that make sense to you? I'm curious if that's NARM aligned or what your thoughts are there.
Well, I've not heard that exact expression, so I can only, speculate about what exactly they mean. But in principle, if they're meaning it in the way that I think they might be meaning it, I would agree with that. Because if we look at this progression that I touched on earlier about first there's protest. That's just a healthy response to the environment. It's a communication even from the infants before there were words or from children that something is wrong. Something is either being neglected or that with children before they have words that they're sick or that they're hungry or, and attuned parents are pretty good at reading those messages and responding. But then it escalates into anger and that it can escalate into rage when that's not dealt with. So it only gets transformed as it gets integrated. So just feeling anger in itself may or may not even be useful because sometimes anger is a secondary emotion for some people. It's their default emotion and they go to it easily. For that person, it's not even an initiation. We then have to switch to some other, what is it that the anger is trying to protect against? And that's often then vulnerability or hurt or, grief or various other kinds of things. But separate from that, even in terms of integrating anger, which is a longer term process, that it's only the first step to being able to put words to the anger. That's the beginning of a transformation process as we're able to put words to it. Because anger is always both a communication to the environment and a communication to the self. anger, when it's communicated to the environment, is to try and change something in the environment, to try and get a need met of some kind, or to particularly, starting as children, that's a normal part of the process. But once the rage and the anger start to get understood and the message that is trying to be communicated is understood, and on a bodily level, the powerful energetics of anger are increasingly able to be tolerated by the client, that's what leads to transformation. That's where the transformation is. So if that's what they're intending by that statement, then I would agree.
Okay, great. Thank you for speaking to that. That was kind of my bonus question. It's been on my mind. I've been kind of chewing on it like, is this a NARM-aligned idea? So yeah, I really appreciate you just kind of riffing on that a little bit.
Sure.
Larry, is there anything else? I know there's lots. Obviously, you wrote a whole book on it, so listeners can get that next fall when it comes out. But anything closing that you'd like our listeners to understand?
Well, I just want to say I particularly enjoyed our time together and your willingness to share your own personal process, personal and as a clinician, and also the clear understanding that, that you have of NARM already that sets the stage for me to be able to maybe take things a little further for many people.
It's such a pleasure. Really enjoy having you.
Thanks.
Well, so your book on shame, is there a title yet? Are you still working with that?
Well, I already have a book out in German that I'm not translating into English. Okay. That one is called Freeing Yourself from Shame and Guilt. This book, the tentative title is Chronic Shame and Guilt. It's written for a general audience, as well as the last part of the book is written for clinicians. But we don't have the subtitle agreed on yet. We're working on what the subtitle will be, but it will definitely have shame in the title. My usual publisher, which is North Atlantic Books, will be publishing, and it should be out like next September.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I'm really excited. This was such a rich conversation, and obviously there will be so much more in the book. So thank you for taking the time, Larry. Really appreciate it.
Enjoyed it. Enjoyed being here.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We hope you're as excited as we are about the upcoming summer 2025 NARM therapist training. This advanced clinical training will equip you with the transformative power of the NeuroAffective Relational Model. Through this training, you'll gain specialized knowledge and skills to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of complex trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and C-PTSD. You'll learn how to integrate a neurobiologically informed clinical approach that promotes post-traumatic growth and supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. Join a community where mindfulness meets clinical expertise and embody professional and personal growth as a catalyst for transformation in your practice and community. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to register for the summer 2025 NARM therapist training and become part of this revolutionary approach to healing complex trauma. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Don't miss this opportunity to deepen your clinical expertise and make a lasting impact on the lives of those you serve. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Spon-Seller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.